Fabric tearing echoes louder than a gunshot in the silent halls of St. Jude's Palace. A priceless piece of royal history stitched with pearls and centuries of legacy lies shredded on the marble floor. Standing over the ruined silk is a proud duchess with a triumphant sneer, completely unaware that her vicious act of sabotage has just sealed her own doom. Within 60 seconds, the heavy boots of the royal guard will march through those doors, and a meticulously planned wedding day will transform into a spectacular, globally televised arrest. No one in the highly insulated, ruthlessly traditional world of the European aristocracy expected Prince Edward, Duke of Somerset, and second in line to the sovereign throne, to fall in love with an art historian from a modest neighborhood in Leeds. Amelia Caldwell was undeniably brilliant, strikingly elegant, and fiercely independent, but she lacked the one currency that mattered in the velvet-lined corridors of St. Jude's Palace pedigree. She did not have a title. She did not have centuries of land ownership tied to her surname. Her ancestors were coal miners and school teachers, not barons and earls. When the engagement was announced to the public on a crisp October morning, the nation celebrated. The press adored the modern fairy tale of a grounded, educated woman capturing the heart of the famously stoic prince. But inside the high walls of the royal estate, the announcement was treated not as a cause for celebration, but as a crisis of state. At the center of this aristocratic outrage was Edward's mother, Duchess Arabella of Somerset. Arabella was a woman carved from ice and ancient protocol. She had spent her entire life adhering to the suffocating rules of the monarchy, sacrificing her own happiness to marry Edward's father, a man she barely knew simply because their bloodlines aligned perfectly. She believed that royal duty was a religion, and in her eyes, Amelia Caldwell was a heretic. Arabella had spent the last decade carefully maneuvering to pair Edward with Lady Victoria Hastings, a prominent aristocrat whose family owned half of the Scottish Highlands. Amelia's sudden arrival shattered years of Arabella's meticulous chess moves. From the very beginning, the Duchess waged a shadow war against her future daughter-in-law. It started with subtle, deniable slights. Arabella would accidentally leave Amelia off the guest list for minor palace dinners. She would speak over her in drawing rooms using archaic aristocratic slang, designed to make Amelia feel isolated. When the press praised Amelia's accessible fashion sense, Arabella leaked anonymous quotes to tabloid columnists calling the future Duchess tragically pedestrian. Exacting, but Amelia was not easily broken. She navigated the viper's nest of the royal court with quiet grace and unyielding composure. Edward, wholly devoted to his fiancée, stood as an impenetrable shield between Amelia and his mother's venom. The more Arabella pushed, the closer the couple became, which only fueled the Duchess's raging resentment. The breaking point, the catalyst that would eventually lead to a crime of spectacular arrogance, occurred 6 weeks before the wedding. King George, Edward's uncle and the reigning monarch, summoned Amelia and Edward to his private study. The king had taken a profound liking to Amelia. He appreciated her sharp intellect and saw her grounding influence as exactly what the monarchy needed to survive in the modern era. During this meeting, King George presented Amelia with a breathtaking wedding gift permission to wear the sovereign's gown. The sovereign's gown was not just a dress, it was a sacred national relic. Commissioned in 1742 for Queen Genevieve's coronation and subsequent wedding, the gown was a masterpiece of haute couture and historical weight. Woven from ivory Spitalfield silk, heavily embroidered with pure silver thread, and encrusted with over 2,000 teardrop diamonds, it was stored in a climate-controlled vault in the royal archives. It belonged to the crown, an artifact insured for upwards of £30 million. It had only been worn 3 times in history, and only by women who were destined to be queen. When word reached Duchess Arabella that an untitled commoner was going to wear the sovereign's gown, witnesses in the palace reported that she went pale, gripping her teacup so hard the porcelain cracked. Arabella herself had begged to wear the gown for her own royal wedding 30 years prior, and King George had flatly denied her, stating she did not possess the necessary rank. The idea that Amelia, a woman whose father sold insurance in Yorkshire, would be draped in the ultimate symbol of royal majesty, was a humiliation Arabella could not stomach. In the Duchess's warped, protocol-obsessed mind, it was an act of theft, and she silently vowed that Amelia Caldwell would never walk down the aisle in that dress. The weeks leading up to the royal wedding were a masterclass in psychological warfare. St. Jude's Palace became a hive of frantic activity, crawling with event planners, security details, florists, and foreign dignitaries. But beneath the polished surface of the preparations, Arabella's desperation was mutating into a dangerous obsession. Arabella began to stalk the palace's west wing, where Amelia had been given a suite of rooms to prepare. The Duchess demanded constant updates from the palace staff regarding the dress fittings. She wanted to know who was altering it, how it was being transported, and when Amelia would be alone with it. The fittings themselves were highly secure operations. Because the sovereign's gown was officially classified as a crown jewel, it could not be left unattended. 2 members of the Royal Guard stood outside the fitting room doors at all times, and a curator from the Royal Trust was present whenever the garment was taken out of its protective archival garment bag. The dress had to be meticulously adjusted to fit Amelia's frame without cutting or permanently altering the historic fabric, a painstaking process of hidden basting stitches and careful draping. During the second fitting, Arabella forced her way into the room, using her rank to bypass the hesitant guards. She swept in like a winter storm, her eyes immediately locking onto Amelia, who was standing on a velvet pedestal illuminated by the grand chandeliers. Amelia looked ethereal. The silver threading of the ancient gown caught the light, creating a halo effect around her. The sheer history of the garment gave her a regal authority that made Arabella's stomach twist with physical sickness. "You look ridiculous," Arabella stated, her voice slicing through the quiet awe of the seamstresses in the room. Amelia didn't flinch. She met the older woman's venomous gaze in the mirror. "Good afternoon, Your Grace. I wasn't aware you were joining us today. Someone has to ensure the crown's property isn't being irreparably damaged by common sweat." Arabella sneered, pacing around the pedestal like a vulture. "It hangs off you like a potato sack. You lack the posture to carry the weight of that silk. But then again, one cannot learn a lifetime of royal bearing in a few short months, no matter how many elocution lessons my son pays for." The head seamstress, a timid Frenchwoman named Madame Dupont, froze her hands trembling as she held a box of pins. "The king seems to disagree," Amelia replied evenly, her voice calm and steady, though her heart pounded fiercely against her ribs. "He told me just yesterday that the gown looks exactly as it did on Queen Genevieve." Arabella's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. The mention of the king's approval was a direct hit to her pride. She stepped uncomfortably close to the pedestal, reaching out a manicured hand to finger the delicate diamond-encrusted lace at the hem of the dress. Kings make mistakes," Arabella whispered, her voice so low only Amelia could hear. "And history has a way of correcting them. Do not get too comfortable in this silk, Miss Caldwell. You are an imposter playing dress-up in a house that will never truly accept you." With that chilling promise, Arabella turned on her heel and swept out of the room. Amelia tried to shake off the encounter, focusing on Edward's love and the supportive texts he sent her between his royal engagements. But Arabella's words lingered like a dark cloud. The Duchess was not a woman who made empty threats. She had the resources, the palace connections, and the sheer malice to ruin everything. Over the next few days, Arabella's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She attempted to bribe the royal florist to change Amelia's bouquet to include yellow carnations, a historic symbol of disdain and rejection. She tried to alter the seating chart at St. George's Chapel to place Amelia's family behind a massive stone pillar. Each petty sabotage was quietly intercepted and corrected by Captain Thomas Wright, the head of the palace guard, and Edward's most trusted confidant. Captain Wright had seen the Duchess's cruelty for years, and he made it his personal mission to ensure the prince's wedding went flawlessly. Recognizing that Arabella was spiraling, Captain Wright quietly doubled the security detail around the sovereign's gown. He implemented a strict protocol. No one was permitted in the dressing room with the gown, unless accompanied by the Royal Trust curator. But Captain Wright underestimated the toxic entitlement of a duchess who believed the palace walls answered only to her. Arabella was not deterred by rules. She believed she was the one who wrote them, and she had found a glaring loophole in the security protocol. The day before the wedding, the palace was in a state of breathless anticipation. The gown had undergone its final press and was moved to the antechamber of Amelia's bridal suite, hanging on a custom velvet mannequin sealed behind a protective glass casing. Tomorrow, Amelia would wear it down the aisle of a cathedral packed with 2,000 global dignitaries and broadcast to an estimated 2 billion people worldwide. Arabella decided that tomorrow would never happen. The morning of the wedding dawned with gray, dramatic clouds that broke just as the sun crested the horizon, casting a golden glow over St. Jude's Palace. By 7 a.m., the estate was a fortress of activity. Media helicopters hovered miles away, held back by a strict no-fly zone, while thousands of citizens lined the parade route, waving flags and cheering. Inside the West Wing, the atmosphere was a tense mixture of excitement and highly choreographed panic. Amelia was in her suite, sitting in a silk robe as a team of makeup artists and hairstylists fluttered around her. Her heart fluttered with a nervous, brilliant joy. Today she was marrying the love of her life. Down the hall, the sovereign's gown had been removed from its glass casing and hung on a heavy brass hook in the private dressing room, ready to be slipped onto the bride in exactly 1 hour. At 8:15 a.m., the intricately planned security schedule experienced a fatal 30-second hiccup. The Royal Trust Curator, a gentleman named Mr. Higgins, suffered a sudden severe bout of food poisoning, a mysterious ailment, later suspected to have been induced by a tainted cup of Earl Grey tea delivered by one of Arabella's loyal footmen. As Mr. Higgins rushed to the lavatory, the 2 guards stationed at the dressing room door received a radio call from the central command room. It was an urgent directive from Duchess Arabella's chief of staff, claiming a security breach at the East Gate required their immediate reinforcement. The order was a complete fabrication, but in the heat of the moment, the guards obeyed protocol and jogged toward the stairs, leaving the dressing room unattended. It was the window Arabella had been waiting for. Dressed in her own imposing mother-of-the-groom attire, a severe dark emerald gown that looked more suited for a funeral than a celebration, the Duchess slipped out of the shadows of the adjoining corridor and stepped into the dressing room. She locked the heavy oak door behind her with a definitive click. The room was silent, smelling of fresh lilies and the faint metallic scent of the hot iron used to steam the veil. There, hanging in the center of the room, was the sovereign's gown. Up close, without the barrier of glass, it was breathtaking. The diamonds caught the morning light filtering through the stained glass windows, throwing prismatic rainbows across the walls. Arabella stared at it, her chest heaving. This dress represented everything she had been denied. It represented the changing of the guard, the modernization of her sacred monarchy, and the ultimate victory of a commoner over centuries of pure bloodlines. "You will not have it," she whispered to the empty room. She walked toward the gown. She didn't look for scissors. She didn't need them. The fabric, while historically preserved, was over 300 years old. The silk was strong, but the intricate lacework connecting the bodice to the skirt was delicate, requiring careful handling. Arabella grabbed the collar of the dress with both hands. Her knuckles turned white. With a violent, guttural sneer, she yanked downward. "Rip!" The sound was horrifying. It was the sound of history being butchered. The 300-year-old silver thread snapped under the sudden, brutal force. Arabella felt a surge of manic adrenaline. She grabbed the heavy folds of the skirt and pulled in opposite directions. The silk gave way with a sickening tear, and dozens of antique diamonds broke loose from their settings, clattering onto the marble floor like a shower of freezing rain. She didn't stop. Driven by decades of repressed rage and unchecked entitlement, the Duchess tore at the sleeves, ripping the delicate Chantilly lace to shreds. She stomped on the trailing hem with the stiletto heel of her shoe, grinding the ivory fabric into the floor, leaving a dark, dirty scuff mark across the pristine silk. Within 30 seconds, a masterpiece of human artistry and royal heritage had been reduced to a mangled, shredded pile of debris. Arabella stood over the ruins, breathing heavily, her pristine hair slightly out of place. A vicious, triumphant smile stretched across her face. Let them try to marry her now, she thought. Let the little commoner walk down the aisle in rags. The king would be furious, of course, but what could he do? She was the Duchess of Somerset. She was untouchable. They would cover it up, blame it on a clumsy maid or a structural failure of the old fabric, and Amelia would be forced to wear a generic, off-the-rack gown. Arabella had won. She turned to leave the room, ready to feign shock when the accident was discovered. But as she reached for the brass handle, the door swung open violently, nearly knocking her backward. Standing in the doorway was Amelia. The bride-to-be had stepped away from her makeup chair to check on the dress, sensing an inexplicable knot of dread in her stomach. Now she stood frozen, her eyes wide as they moved from the manicured Duchess to the devastating wreckage on the floor. The diamonds scattered across the marble caught the light, sparkling mockingly amidst the torn strips of centuries-old silk. For a terrifying, stretched-out moment, neither woman spoke. The silence was absolute, heavy with the gravity of what had just occurred. Arabella lifted her chin, recovering her aristocratic mask. She stepped over the ruined dress, crushing another pearl beneath her shoe. "Oh, dear," Arabella said, her voice dripping with fake theatrical sympathy. "It seems the antique fabric was simply too decayed to hold its own weight. What a tragedy, Miss Caldwell. It appears you won't be playing the Queen today after all." Amelia did not cry. She didn't scream or collapse into hysterics. Her eyes moved from the destroyed gown back to Arabella's smug face. Her shock rapidly cooled into something much more dangerous, absolute clarity. "You didn't just ruin my wedding dress, Arabella." Amelia said, her voice eerily calm, possessing a steel that made the Duchess involuntarily pause. "You really have no idea what you've just done, do you?" Arabella scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, please, spare me the dramatics. It's a piece of cloth. Edward will buy you a new one. Now step aside." "It's not just a piece of cloth," Amelia replied, not moving an inch from the doorway. "It is the sovereign's gown. It belongs to the royal trust. It is an insured artifact of the crown." "I am the crown, you insolent girl," Arabella hissed, stepping forward to push past her. "No," a deep booming voice echoed from the hallway behind Amelia. "You are not." Amelia stepped aside. Standing directly behind her, flanked by 4 heavily armed members of the Royal Palace Guard, was Captain Thomas Wright. His face was a mask of cold, unyielding authority. Captain Wright looked past Arabella to the destroyed gown on the floor. A muscle feathered in his jaw. The sheer audacity of the crime was staggering. "Captain," Arabella barked, attempting to seize control of the narrative. "Arrest this woman immediately. Miss Caldwell has just destroyed a royal artifact in a fit of bridal hysteria. I caught her in the act." Captain Wright didn't blink. He slowly reached to the lapel of his uniform, tapping the small, blinking black lens of his standard-issue body camera. A device that had been recording audio and video for the last 5 minutes, capturing the undeniable sound of tearing fabric from the hallway and the Duchess's own confession of the accident moments ago. "Duchess Arabella of Somerset." Captain Wright said, his voice echoing loudly down the historic corridors, loud enough for the gathering staff and wedding planners to hear. "Under the Crown Preservation Act of 1842, the willful destruction of a sovereign artifact is classified not as vandalism, but as an act of treason against the reigning monarch." Arabella's smug smile vanished. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking suddenly frail and very, very old. "Don't be absurd, Captain. I am the mother of the future king. You answer to me. I answer directly to His Majesty, King George." Captain Wright corrected, stepping into the room. He gestured to the 2 guards beside him. The heavy rhythmic thud of the guards' boots on the marble floor sounded like the beating of a drum. They marched into the room, their expressions blank, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Duchess Arabella," Captain Wright commanded, pulling a pair of heavy steel cuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest." The click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around Duchess Arabella's wrists echoed like a gunshot in the silent dressing room. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to suspend itself. Arabella stared down at the gleaming metal binding her wrists together, her mind completely unable to process the visual information. Duchesses did not wear handcuffs. Women of her bloodline did not get arrested. It was a physical impossibility, a glitch in the very fabric of her reality. "Oh, God, take these off me," Arabella whispered, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with an incomprehensible mounting rage. She yanked her arms, but Captain Thomas Wright held the chain with the immovable grip of a vice. "Take them off this instant. I am the Duchess of Somerset. You are a glorified security guard. Wright, I will have you stripped of your rank and thrown into the street. You have the right to remain silent, Your Grace." Captain Wright replied, his tone as detached and professional as if he were reading a weather report. "And I highly suggest you exercise it. Everything you say is being recorded and transmitted directly to the Royal Archives security servers." Before Arabella could launch into another venomous tirade, the heavy oak doors of the suite were thrown open. The commotion in the hallway had reached the ears of the two men who held the ultimate power in St. Jude's palace. Prince Edward burst into the room, his tuxedo halfway buttoned, his face pale with panic. Right behind him was King George, flanked by his private secretary, Lord Arthur Pendleton, and a phalanx of heavily armed royal protection officers. Edward's eyes darted frantically around the room. He saw Amelia standing unharmed by the doorway, her posture rigid, but her eyes clear. He let out a breathless sigh of relief, crossing the room in 2 long strides to pull her into a desperate protective embrace. Only then did he look down at the floor. The prince froze. He stared at the shredded, mangled remains of the sovereign's gown. He saw the antique diamonds scattered across the marble like broken glass, the torn Chantilly lace, the vicious scuff mark from a stiletto heel on the historic ivory silk. Finally, his gaze lifted to his mother standing in handcuffs held by the captain of the guard. "Mother." Edward breathed, his voice hollow, completely devoid of the usual warmth he held for her. "What have you done?" "Edward, thank God!" Arabella cried out, immediately adopting the desperate, fragile tone of a victim. She pulled against Wright's grip, thrusting her cuffed hands toward her son. "This madman has assaulted me." The little commoner tore the dress in a fit of nerves, and when I tried to stop her, Wright ambushed me. "Tell your uncle to arrest her. Tell him how." Edward didn't move toward her. He didn't even flinch. He looked at the body camera mounted on Captain Wright's chest, the small red light blinking steadily, and then back to the manic-lying eyes of the woman who raised him. "Stop it," Edward said. His voice was terrifyingly quiet. It was the voice of a future king. "Just stop, Mother. I know you. I have known what you are capable of for years, but I never thought you would stoop to this level of depravity. You didn't just try to destroy Amelia, you tried to destroy us." "Edward," Arabella stammered, genuinely shocked by the coldness in his eyes. "Silence!" A voice boomed, rattling the very window panes of the room. King George stepped forward. The monarch was usually a man of gentle demeanor and warm smiles, beloved by the public for his grandfatherly charm. But in that moment, the grandfather was gone. Standing before them was the sovereign of the realm, radiating a dark, crushing authority that made the temperature in the room plummet. King George walked slowly past the handcuffed Duchess, not even granting her a glance, and knelt down with surprising agility for a man of his age. His hands, bearing the heavy golden signet ring of the monarchy, reached out to touch the shredded edge of the ancient silk. He picked up a loose teardrop diamond that had fallen from the bodice. When he stood back up, his face was carved from granite. 300 years. King George said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "This gown survived the Blitz. It survived palace fires. It survived revolutions across the Channel. It represented the unbroken chain of our history. And you, Arabella, have butchered it in a petty, jealous tantrum. Your Majesty, I assure you it was the girl." Arabella tried one last desperate time. "Lord Pendleton." King George snapped, cutting her off completely. The private secretary stepped forward, holding a sleek tablet. "Yes, Your Majesty. Captain Wright's body camera footage has already been uploaded to the encrypted server. We have audio of the fabric tearing while the Duchess was locked alone inside, and video of her confessing to the accident before noticing the captain." Arabella's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The absolute irrefutable proof was a guillotine dropping on her neck. King George finally turned his piercing gaze upon his sister-in-law. You thought your title made you a god in this palace. You thought the rules of decency did not apply to you because of your bloodline. But let me remind you of the law, Arabella. The sovereign's gown is property of the crown. Its destruction is not a civil matter. It is a federal crime. Arabella's knees buckled slightly, the reality of the situation finally piercing her delusion. George, please, we are family. You ceased being family the moment you attacked my future niece. The king replied coldly. He looked at Captain Wright. Remove her from my sight. Take her to the sovereign's detainment suite in the lower levels. She is not to speak to the press. She is not to have her phone, and she is not to attend this wedding. You can't do this. Arabella shrieked, her aristocratic composure entirely shattering as the guards began to physically drag her toward the door. I am the mother of the groom. It is my right to be there. Edward, do not let them do this to your mother. Edward stood with his arm firmly wrapped around Amelia's waist. He looked at Arabella as she was pulled into the hallway, his expression an impenetrable fortress of resolve. You lost the right to be at my wedding the moment you walked into this room, Edward said flatly. Goodbye, Mother. The heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off Arabella's hysterical screams. The silence that followed was suffocating. The villain had been removed, but the wreckage remained. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed ominously. It was 9 a.m. In exactly 2 hours, the grand bells of St. George's Chapel would ring, signaling the start of the royal procession. Outside the palace gates, millions of people were cheering, utterly oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding in the West Wing. Madame Dupont, the head seamstress, had collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands, weeping uncontrollably. Beside her stood Dr. Penelope Hastings, the lead textile historian from the Royal Trust, who had rushed up from the archives the moment she heard the news. Dr. Hastings was pale, wearing white cotton gloves, gently examining the torn edges of the sovereign's gown. It's catastrophic, Dr. Hastings murmured, her voice shaking. The bodice is entirely shredded. The structural integrity of the upper lacework is gone. It would take a team of microscopic restorers 6 months to reweave this silver threading. Your Majesty, there is no gown. King George let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his tired face. He looked at Amelia, his eyes filled with profound sorrow. Amelia, my dear, I am so deeply sorry. We can delay the ceremony. We can issue a statement regarding a security incident, push the wedding to tomorrow, and have the designers pull an alternative piece from the vault. Edward squeezed Amelia's hand. Whatever you want, darling. We can wait. We can go to a private chapel right now and do it in secret. I don't care about the spectacle. I just want you. Amelia looked down at her hands, then at the shredded dress, and finally up at the faces of the people who loved her. She took a deep, steadying breath. The panic that had threatened to consume her had completely vanished, replaced by an unbreakable, steely resolve. Arabella wanted her to hide. Arabella wanted the wedding delayed, ruined, or diminished. No, Amelia said firmly. Her voice rang clear across the dressing room. We are not delaying, we are not hiding. If I don't walk down that aisle today precisely on time, she wins. I will not give her that satisfaction. But the dress, Madame Dupont sobbed, gesturing to the ruins. You have nothing to wear, Miss Caldwell. The world is expecting a royal bride. Amelia walked over to the velvet pedestal. She didn't look at the ruined upper half of the sovereign's gown. She looked at the skirt. Because Arabella had focused her violent rage on the bodice and the sleeves pulling them apart, the massive sweeping skirt of the gown, an ocean of ivory silk embroidered with cascading silver and intact diamonds, was largely unharmed save for a single scuff mark near the hem. Amelia's mind, trained as an art historian to see the beauty in salvaged antiquities, began to race. Madame Dupont looked at the skirt. It's intact, isn't it? The seamstress wiped her eyes, looking up in confusion. The skirt? Yes, the waistline seems held, but it's just a skirt, miss. It's useless without the bodice. Not necessarily. Amelia said, her eyes flashing with sudden inspiration. She turned to her wardrobe. For the evening reception, you designed that modern silk crepe slip dress for me. It's sleek, it has a beautiful structured corset, and the color matches the ivory of the antique silk. Madame Dupont gasped slowly, rising to her feet as the vision took hold in her mind. You want to combine them, Miss Caldwell, to alter a royal artifact. Amelia turned to King George. Your Majesty, with your permission, we don't rebuild the past. We adapt it. We carry it forward. King George's eyes widened, and a slow, incredibly proud smile spread across his face. Do it, the king commanded, looking at the seamstresses. Do whatever she asks. What followed was a masterclass in high-pressure couture engineering. The dressing room was transformed into an emergency surgical theater. Dr. Hastings used specialized archival shears to carefully separate the ruined bodice from the heavy diamond-encrusted skirt of the sovereign's gown. Madame Dupont and a frantic team of 6 assistants brought out the sleek, minimalist reception dress. It was 9:45 a.m. The ticking of the clock was deafening. Amelia stood frozen on the pedestal wearing the modern slip dress, while the team literally built the new gown around her body. They took the massive historic skirt and draped it over the sleek modern silhouette using heavy platinum pins to secure the 300-year-old fabric to the contemporary corset. The contrast was absolutely breathtaking. The top half of the dress was fiercely modern, clean lines, bare shoulders, and unadorned elegance that highlighted Amelia's natural beauty. But from the waist down, it erupted into a cascade of pure historical majesty, the silver thread and diamonds sparkling with an ancient fire. To cover the seam where the two dresses met, Amelia requested the ruined Chantilly lace from the torn sleeves. Madame Dupont expertly salvaged the largest, most beautiful pieces of the lace, folding them over the waistline to create a stunning asymmetrical basque waist that looked entirely intentional. At 10:30 a.m., Dr. Hastings meticulously brushed out the scuff mark on the hem with a specialized chemical solvent. At 10:45 a.m., Captain Wright knocked on the door. 5 minutes, everyone. The motorcade is ready. Amelia stepped off the pedestal. She looked into the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She didn't look like a girl trying to play dress-up in an old queen's clothes. She looked like a new kind of royal. She looked unstoppable. Madame Dupont, her fingers literally bleeding from the frantic high-speed sewing, fell to her knees and adjusted the massive train. "It is a miracle," she whispered in awe. "It is the most beautiful gown I have ever seen." King George offered Amelia his arm. By tradition, because Amelia's father had passed away years ago, the king had volunteered to walk her down the aisle. "Are you ready to make history?" "Amelia?" the king asked softly. Amelia smiled, her eyes fierce and bright. "Let's go show them what survival looks like, Your Majesty." Deep beneath the opulent sunlit corridors of St. Jude's Palace lay a sector that had not seen use since the chaotic days of the early 20th century. The sovereign's detainment suite was entirely devoid of gold leaf velvet or chandeliers. It was a secure windowless bunker made of cold, reinforced concrete, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. It was here, sitting on a rigid metal chair bolted to the floor, that Duchess Arabella found herself. The handcuffs had been removed, but the door was locked from the outside. Standing silently in the corners of the room were Officer Miller and Officer Davies, 2 heavily vetted palace guards who completely ignored the Duchess's constant blistering demands. "I demand my lawyer!" Arabella screamed, her voice hoarse, echoing off the concrete walls. "Get Charles Danforth on the phone immediately. This is an illegal detention. You cannot hold a peer of the realm without formal charges." The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. In walked Simon Beaufort, the Crown's chief legal counsel. He was a tall, incredibly thin man with a reputation for absolute ruthlessness in the courtroom. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and did not look the least bit intimidated by the raging Duchess. "Sit down, Arabella," Beaufort said coldly, not bothering with her royal title. How dare you speak to me like that, Simon? Arabella spat, though she slowly lowered herself back into the metal chair, unnerved by his tone. Call Charles Danforth, now. I did call Mr. Danforth, Beaufort replied smoothly, opening his briefcase and pulling out a stack of heavily sealed documents. He respectfully declined to represent you. In fact, he hung up the phone the moment I informed him of the charges. Arabella's face drained of color. Charles Danforth had been her family's fixer for decades. What charges? It was addressed I will write a check for the damages. You cannot write a check for treason, Arabella, Beaufort stated plainly. He slid a piece of paper across the metal table. Under the Crown Preservation Act, the willful destruction of an artifact classified as a sovereign relic carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a federal facility. It is not considered vandalism. It is considered an attack on the physical embodiment of the crown itself. Furthermore, His Majesty has already drafted the letters patent to officially strip you of your title, your lands, and your royal income. By sunset today, you will no longer be a duchess. You will be a civilian awaiting trial. Arabella stared at the paper, her breath catching in her throat. The words blurred before her eyes. Stripped of her title, evicted from her estates, a federal prison. The reality of her actions, the monumental catastrophic stupidity of her arrogance, finally crashed down upon her. She began to shake violently. They won't. The public won't stand for it. She whispered a desperate, delusional plea. I am beloved. I am the mother of the groom. The wedding is ruined anyway. They will see she is cursed. Beaufort didn't say a word. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his smartphone, and placed it on the table between them. He tapped the screen, bringing up the live global broadcast of the royal wedding. Arabella leaned in, her eyes wide, desperate to see the chaos she had caused. She expected to see a canceled ceremony, a weeping bride, a humiliated king. Instead, the screen showed the spectacular interior of St. George's Chapel. 2,000 guests dripping in jewels and military regalia stood in absolute reverent silence. The massive choir was singing a soaring angelic anthem that seemed to vibrate through the tiny speaker of the phone. And then the camera panned to the back of the cathedral. Arabella let out a choked gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Walking down the aisle, her arm looped through King George's, was Amelia Caldwell. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly flawless. The gown, the impossible hybrid masterpiece of modern design and ancient royal silk, caught the light of 1,000 camera flashes. The historic skirt flowed behind her like a river of diamonds, while the sleek modern bodice framed her perfectly. The television commentators were weeping. A breathtaking tribute to history and modernity, a British anchor whispered over the broadcast. Amelia has seamlessly blended the sovereign's legacy with her own unique strength. It is without a doubt the greatest royal wedding gown in history. At the altar stood Prince Edward. As he looked at his bride, tears streamed freely down his face. The love and admiration in his eyes were so profound, so absolute, that it felt almost intrusive to witness. The camera angle shifted briefly, showing the front row of the chapel. Where Duchess Arabella should have been sitting in the velvet-lined seat of honor designated for the mother of the groom, there was an empty space. But it wasn't just empty. Edward had ordered the chair removed completely. The space where she belonged had been erased as if she had never existed at all. In the cold, sterile bunker beneath the palace, Arabella let out a guttural sob. The sound was raw, stripped of all aristocratic pretense. It was the sound of a woman realizing that she had burned down her own kingdom just to watch a girl choke on the smoke, only to find the girl was entirely fireproof. Beaufort watched her cry for a moment, his expression completely devoid of pity. He picked up his phone, silencing the beautiful choir, and plunged the concrete room back into suffocating silence. The ceremony will conclude in 30 minutes, Beaufort said, gathering his documents and snapping his briefcase shut. After that, the unmarked transport van will arrive at the underground loading dock. You will be transferred to a high-security holding facility in London to await your arraignment. I strongly suggest you prepare yourself, Arabella. The The world outside is going to be very, very cold. Beaufort turned and walked out of the room, the heavy steel door slamming shut and locking with a harsh metallic finality. Above her, millions of people cheered as the newly minted Duke and Duchess of Somerset shared their first kiss on the balcony of St. Jude's Palace. But down in the dark, stripped of her silk, her title, and her son, the former Duchess, sat entirely alone in the silence, left with nothing but the ghosts of her own devastating hubris. The transition from the velvet-lined corridors of St. Jude's Palace to the sterile, unforgiving walls of Her Majesty's prison Bronzefield happened in the blink of an eye. For the first 48 hours, former Duchess Arabella refused to eat, drink, or speak to the prison guards. She sat on the thin, lumpy mattress of her high-security isolation cell, staring at the concrete wall, convinced that at any moment the heavy steel door would open and King George would walk in to apologize for the dreadful misunderstanding. She waited for the royal motorcade to whisk her back to her estates. She waited for her silk sheets and her morning Earl Grey tea served in fine bone china. But the door only opened to deliver bland, lukewarm institutional meals slid through a metal slot. The monarchy had completely severed ties. Realizing that no royal rescue was coming, Arabella shifted her strategy from denial to total warfare. If the king would not protect her, she would destroy the crown's pristine public image. She used her one daily phone call to contact Gregory Pearce, a notoriously ruthless London defense attorney, known for representing disgraced billionaires and scandalous politicians. Pearce was a shark in a bespoke suit, a man who thrived on media circuses and moral ambiguity. He immediately recognized Arabella's case as the trial of the century. Within a week of the royal wedding, while Prince Edward and Amelia were on a heavily guarded honeymoon in the Maldives, Pearce launched a massive, highly coordinated media offensive. He understood that in the court of law, Arabella was dead to rights. The body camera footage from Captain Thomas Wright was undeniable. Therefore, Pearce had to win in the court of public opinion. He leaked carefully curated statements to sympathetic tabloid editors. The narrative was expertly spun. Arabella was not a vindictive, entitled snob. She was a deeply concerned mother driven to a temporary manic breakdown by a manipulative, social climbing daughter-in-law who was tearing the royal family apart. The tragic fall of a mother's love read one headline in the Daily Chronicle. Did the crown break the Duchess? Inside Arabella's secret mental health battle screamed another. Pearce's legal team filed motions claiming that the pressure of the royal wedding, combined with a severe adverse reaction to a new prescription anxiety medication, had caused Arabella to experience a brief psychotic episode. They argued that putting a 58-year-old grandmother in a federal penitentiary for tearing a piece of old fabric was a draconian, tyrannical abuse of power by King George. The public, notoriously fickle and addicted to royal drama, began to fracture. Protests erupted outside the palace gates. Some held signs calling for Arabella's head, while others held banners reading, "Free the Duchess." Down with the Commoner talk show hosts debated whether Amelia had intentionally provoked Arabella into a meltdown to eliminate her from the royal hierarchy. The victim-blaming machine was running at full capacity. Inside the palace, King George's advisors begged the monarch to issue a royal gag order or offer Arabella a quiet plea deal to make the scandal disappear. They argued that the monarchy could not survive a televised public trial where the crown's dirty laundry would be aired to the globe. But when Edward and Amelia returned from their honeymoon, they marched straight into the king's study, completely rejecting the advisors' cowardice. Amelia, now officially the Duchess of Somerset, looked the advisors in the eye with a terrifying, calm authority. "If we hide this, we validate her behavior," Amelia stated firmly. "We send a message to the world that if you have enough money and a fancy title, the laws of this country do not apply to you. Arabella wanted to humiliate me on the global stage. Let her have the global stage. Let the public see exactly who she is." Edward held his wife's hand, looking at his uncle. "No plea deals, no royal pardons. We take her to trial, and we let the chips fall where they may." King George, beaming with pride at the unyielding strength of his nephew and new niece, slammed his fist on his oak desk. "Then it is settled. The crown does not negotiate with terrorists, and make no mistake, my sister-in-law is a terrorist to this institution. The stage was set for the Old Bailey. The trial of the Crown versus Arabella of Somerset was officially docketed, and the world held its breath. 6 months after the shredded silk hit the marble floor of the bridal suite, the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, affectionately known as the Old Bailey, was surrounded by thousands of reporters, satellite trucks, and riot police. Inside courtroom number 1, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Judge Jonathan Gable, a stern, no-nonsense magistrate, presided over the case. On one side sat Eleanor Whitmore, the Crown's fiercest lead prosecutor. On the other sat Gregory Pearce, looking dangerously confident beside Arabella. The former Duchess had undergone a calculated physical transformation for the jury. Gone were the emerald gowns and the diamond brooches. She wore a simple, modest gray cardigan over a pale blouse. Her hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was left deliberately flat. She sat with her shoulders hunched, holding a tissue, playing the role of a fragile, broken woman destroyed by a ruthless establishment. For the first 2 weeks of the trial, Pierce's strategy was brutally effective. He cross-examined Captain Thomas Wright, painting the guard as a trigger-happy militant who violently assaulted a confused elderly woman. He grilled the Royal Trust curators, attempting to devalue the sovereign's gown by pointing out that previous restorations had already compromised its original 1742 integrity, thereby making the federal charge of destroying a priceless relic an exaggeration. But the true battle line was drawn when Pierce attempted to sell the jury on the narrative of Arabella's sudden medication-induced psychotic break. He paraded private physicians onto the stand, who testified that the Duchess had been under immense psychological strain. Pierce argued that the tearing of the dress was an impulsive, uncharacteristic accident caused by a chemical imbalance, not a premeditated act of treason. Public opinion polls showed a dangerous shift. People were beginning to feel sorry for her. Eleanor Whitmore knew she was losing the jury's sympathy. She needed a kill shot. She needed to prove that Arabella's actions were not a sudden mental break, but the climax of a long, vicious, highly calculated campaign of terror. On the morning of the 15th day of the trial, Whitmore stood up and called a surprise witness that made the blood drain entirely from Arabella's face. The Crown calls Margaret Linley to the stand. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Margaret Linley was not just a maid. She had been Arabella's personal senior secretary for 15 years. She knew where every skeleton was buried who held the shovels, and exactly how much dirt was moved. Margaret walked to the witness box. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and an incredibly stiff spine. For a decade and a half, she had endured Arabella's verbal abuse, having objects thrown at her head and being forced to work 90-hour weeks while being belittled for her working-class accent. Margaret took the oath, sat down, and adjusted the microphone. She did not look at Arabella. Mrs. Linley. Prosecutor Whitmore began projecting her voice across the silent courtroom. The defense has painted a picture of a sudden, unpredictable mental breakdown. In your 15 years managing the defendant's schedule and correspondence, did you witness a woman losing her grip on reality? No objection, Pierce shouted, jumping to his feet. The witness is not a psychiatrist. Overruled, Judge Gable snapped. She may testify to her observations. Proceed. No. Margaret answered, her voice clear and steady. The defendant was never out of control. In fact, she was the most highly controlling individual I have ever met. Every action, every slight, every tantrum was a calculated weapon used to exert dominance, especially when it came to Amelia Caldwell. Whitmore approached the stand, handing Margaret a thick, leather-bound ledger. Can you identify this item, Mrs. Linley Satcharmam? Arabella visibly panicked, grabbing Pierce's forearm so hard her nails dug through his suit jacket. Do something, she hissed frantically. Stop her. That is the private accounting ledger for the Somerset Children's Foundation, Margaret stated. A royal charity over which the defendant had sole discretionary authority. And what did you discover while reviewing this ledger the week before the royal wedding? I discovered that for 8 months, the defendant had been siphoning hundreds of thousands of pounds meant for pediatric hospitals and funneling the money through offshore shell companies. The funds were used to pay a network of tabloid journalists and palace insiders to plant defamatory stories about Miss Caldwell. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. Reporters scrambled for their phones. The judge banged his gavel, fiercely demanding order. Embezzling royal charity funds was a bombshell that obliterated the concerned mother defense in a matter of seconds. "Are you telling this court," Whitmore pressed, raising her voice over the murmurs, "that the defendant stole from sick children to finance a media smear campaign against her son's fiancé?" "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "But that is not all. I also have evidence regarding the destruction of the sovereign's gown." Whitmore pulled a small, clear evidence bag from her briefcase. Inside was a cheap prepaid burner phone. "Mrs. Linley, where did you find this device?" "I found it hidden inside the false bottom of the defendant's jewelry box in her private dressing room while packing her belongings after her arrest," Margaret explained. "I handed it over to Captain Wright immediately." Whitmore turned to the jury, holding the phone up. "Ladies and gentlemen, the defense claims the destruction of the dress was an impulsive medication-induced accident. Yet text messages recovered from this burner phone tell a very different story. 3 days before the wedding, the defendant texted a third-party palace technician named David O'Connor. The message reads, "I need the security cameras in the West Wing hallway looped between 8 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. on the morning of the wedding. Payment will be dropped at the usual location." "Your Honor," Pierce stood up, his face flushed. "Objection. This proves nothing about the dress. She could have been seeking privacy. Privacy to do what Mr. Pierce—" Whitmore fired back, her eyes flashing with triumph. "To commit a federal crime without an audience?" The technician confessed last night in police custody. He admitted to disabling the hallway cameras. But he made a mistake. He failed to disable the backup audio servers, which is why we have the recording of the fabric tearing. Whitmore walked slowly toward Arabella, her voice dripping with absolute condemnation. "This was not an accident. This was a premeditated, highly orchestrated hit. You plotted for days, bribed staff, hacked palace security, and waited for the exact moment the dress was unguarded to butcher it. You are not a victim of mental illness, Arabella. You are a predator." The courtroom was dead silent. Arabella could no longer contain the toxic venom that had been boiling inside her for 6 months. Her meticulously crafted facade of the fragile victim completely shattered. She sprang to her feet, knocking her chair backward, her eyes wild with aristocratic fury. "You ungrateful peasant!" Arabella shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at Margaret Linley. "I gave you a livelihood, I let you breathe the air of royalty, and you betray me for a cheap thrill in a courtroom. You are nothing, and that little commoner tramp, Amelia, is nothing. I tore that wretched dress because it belonged to my family, not hers. I am the blood of kings. I answer to no one. I would do it again. Do you hear me? I would burn the entire palace down before I let that untitled street rat wear the crown's silk, kotoki." Her horrific screaming confession echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the Old Bailey. Gregory Pierce slowly sat down, resting his head in his hands. He didn't even try to object. The case was over. His client had just publicly executed her own defense on live television. Judge Gable stared down at the raging woman, his expression one of absolute disgust. "Bailiffs, restrain the defendant and force her into her seat." As the officers grabbed Arabella's arms, forcing her down, she looked around the courtroom. She looked at the horrified jury. She looked at the reporters typing furiously. And finally, she looked at the gallery where Prince Edward and Amelia sat quietly watching her true monstrous nature be broadcast to the entire world. Amelia didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply looked at Arabella with a chilling, absolute pity. And to Arabella, that pity was worse than a death sentence. The jury did not take long. In a trial that had spanned nearly a month, the deliberation lasted a mere 4 hours. When the forepersons stood up to read the verdict, the silence in the courtroom was so profound you could hear the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. On the charge of premeditated destruction of a sovereign relic, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of embezzlement of charitable funds, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of treason against the crown under the Act of 1842, we find the defendant guilty. Arabella did not react. She sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, her mind completely detached from the reality of her environment. The delusion of her supremacy had been so absolute that the human brain could not process its sudden violent death. Judge Jonathan Gable adjusted his robes and looked down from the bench. Arabella of Somerset, you stood before this court and demanded to be treated as a superior being. You weaponized your wealth and your title to abuse your staff, steal from dying children, and destroy a piece of this nation's history, all to satisfy a petty malicious jealousy against a young woman who showed you nothing but grace. Judge Gable leaned forward, his voice thundering with the full authority of the British legal system. You are not a superior being. You are a common thief, a vandal, and a disgrace to the institution you claim to revere. His Majesty the King has already signed the letters patent permanently stripping you of your HRH status, your titles, and your estates. You are now legally and officially Arabella Spencer, a private citizen. Arabella squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear escaping as the reality of the words finally pierced her armor. For your crimes, Judge Gable concluded, I sentence you to 12 years without the possibility of early parole in a high-security federal penitentiary. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay complete financial restitution to the Somerset Children's Foundation. Take her down. The bailiffs approached. There was no media spin left to save her. There were no royal guards to defer to her. She was handcuffed, turned away from the cameras, and led through a small wooden door at the back of the courtroom, disappearing into the dark subterranean holding cells of the Old Bailey. 1 year later, the grand opening of the new modern art and history wing at the Royal Victoria Museum was the social event of the decade. Thousands of people gathered outside while the global press lined the red carpet. A black Bentley pulled up to the entrance. The doors opened, and out stepped Prince Edward and Amelia, the beloved Duke and Duchess of Somerset. Amelia was absolutely glowing, her hand resting gently on the visible swell of her first pregnancy. The crowd erupted into deafening cheers, chanting her name. She had become a symbol of modern resilience, a woman who walked into the fire of aristocratic toxicity and emerged entirely unscathed. Inside the museum, King George stood proudly next to a massive custom-built climate-controlled glass exhibition case. The room was packed with dignitaries and art historians. Amelia walked to the front of the room, smiling warmly at the king, and pulled the velvet rope to officially unveil the exhibit. There, bathed in soft, dramatic gallery lighting, stood the sovereign's gown. It was no longer just a relic of 1742. It was the exact hybrid masterpiece that Amelia had worn down the aisle. The immaculate modern crepe bodice seamlessly blended into the sweeping, diamond-encrusted historical skirt. The salvaged Chantilly lace wrapped beautifully around the waistline. It was a breathtaking physical manifestation of the monarchy's survival, respecting the ancient past, while boldly embracing the modern future. The plaque beneath the glass case simply read, "The Sovereign's Gown," restored and redefined by Her Royal Highness, Amelia Duchess of Somerset. A testament to the fact that history cannot be destroyed. It can only be rebuilt stronger. Miles away from the glittering lights of the museum, in a bleak concrete wing of Her Majesty's prison, Bronzefield, the evening routine was underway. Inmate 849. O, formerly known as Duchess Arabella, sat in the loud metallic cafeteria. She wore standard-issue gray sweatpants and a shapeless yellow t-shirt. Her perfectly dyed hair had grown out into stark, wiry gray roots. The skin that had once been treated with $1,000 caviar creams was dull and deeply lined by the stress of incarceration. She sat entirely alone at a long metal table eating a plate of lukewarm, unseasoned stew. The other inmates avoided her. Her constant delusional mutterings about how she used to own castles and command armies had labeled her a pariah even among criminals. High up in the corner of the cafeteria, a small caged television was playing the evening news. Arabella looked up her plastic spoon, pausing halfway to her mouth. On the screen, the news anchor was enthusiastically covering the museum gala. The camera zoomed in on Amelia, radiant and laughing, holding Prince Edward's hand as they stood triumphantly before the beautiful rebuilt sovereign's gown. The banner across the bottom of the screen read, "The new face of the monarchy Duchess, Amelia announces royal baby." Arabella stared at the screen, her chest tightening with an unbearable, suffocating agony. She had tried to humiliate a commoner, and in doing so, she had elevated that commoner to the status of a global icon, while completely erasing herself from history. A burly prison guard walked past the table, tapping his baton against the metal chair. "Eat your slop, Spencer. Rec time is over in 5 minutes." Arabella lowered her gaze from the television to her plastic tray. She picked up her spoon, the harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off the cheap plastic, and finally understood the true depth of her punishment. It wasn't the concrete walls or the terrible food. It was the absolute crushing irrelevance. She was nothing, and Amelia was everything. In the cold silence of her own making, the forgotten Duchess took a bite of her stew entirely alone in the dark. And that is how a toxic mother-in-law's ultimate act of sabotage turned into the most satisfying karma in royal history. Arabella tried to destroy Amelia's moment, but instead she gave her the ultimate crown and bought herself a one-way ticket to a concrete cell. Do you think 12 years was enough for stealing from a charity and destroying history? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you loved this dramatic tale of royal revenge and justice, smash that like button. Share this video with your friends and subscribe for more jaw-dropping true stories.